I remember the day clearly. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that sits heavy in a house and makes your chest ache. I had been sitting in the living room, the soft hum of the refrigerator my only companion. I glanced at the phone again and again. Nothing, no call, no message. Just the small blinking light reminding me that life was moving forward somewhere else without me. When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. I smiled because somehow that seemed easier than the lump of grief forming in my throat. She didn't look at me as she spoke, eyes fixed on the phone in her hand. "Maybe it's time you went," she said. I nodded quietly, feeling the words wrap around me like a cold wind. I walked to the bedroom, gathered a few things, and left. The door clicked softly behind me. Outside, the world was busy and indifferent, and I felt small, invisible, yet deep inside, I carried hope. Hope that someday my son would call, that someday he would hear my voice and remember that I had always been there, waiting, loving, never judging. Even now, I can still see the empty hallway, the soft echo of my footsteps. I wonder if he remembers that day, the day I left without a fight, without a single harsh word. Or if, like me, he feels the emptiness, the missed moments, the silent phone that never rang. The kettle whistled again that morning, a sound too loud for a house so quiet. I reached to turn it off, though no one was there to complain about the noise. It was habit more than anything. Everything I did these days was out of habit. I poured 2 cups of tea like I had for years, then set one on the other side of the table, his side. The chair never moved. The morning light spilled across the faded yellow curtains, same ones I'd hung back when he was little, back when he'd leave jam stains on the kitchen counter, and I'd pretend to scold him just to make him laugh. Those curtains had seen his first steps, his school mornings, his long teenage silences, and then the day he packed his suitcase. He had smiled that day, said, "Ma, don't cry. I'll visit after the wedding." And I believed him. I really did. It's been 4 years now. The town hasn't changed much. Same church bell on Sundays, same white fence outside the grocery store, same group of old men at the diner who still talk about the weather as if it were breaking news. Life goes on in small towns, quietly, like a clock that refuses to stop ticking. But my clock stopped the day he left. Sometimes I wonder if it was my fault, if I raised him to be too polite, too ambitious, too distant. His wife, Linda, writes sometimes. She's kind in her letters, always says, "We've been busy. You know how life gets." And I nod to the paper as if it were her voice in the room. I fold it neatly, place it in the drawer beside all the others. I never reply. The truth is, I wouldn't know what to say anymore. This old house creaks at night. The walls remember laughter that isn't here. I still keep his room the way he left it, the baseball glove by the window, his old denim jacket hanging on the door. Dusk gathers, but I can't bring myself to move anything. Sometimes I sit there just to feel closer. You'd think a mother would get used to silence, but you don't. Silence grows like ivy wrapping around the edges of your heart until it's hard to breathe. And yet, every Sunday morning, I still bake his favorite apple pie. Just in case he remembers. Just in case that old promise, "I'll visit after the wedding," still means something. The first year after the wedding came and went like a quiet storm. I sent them a Christmas card that December, red ribbon, silver snowflakes, a little handwritten note inside, "Love you both, stay warm, and don't forget to eat properly." I waited by the mailbox for days after. When the reply finally came, it was from Linda. Neat handwriting, kind words, but somehow distant. She said Daniel was working long hours, that they were adjusting to the new city, that they'd visit when things settled down. Things, it seems, never really settled down. The next few months turned into a blur of silence. No letters, no phone calls, Just me in the house, two old companions, keeping each other company through long evenings. Sometimes I'd walk to town and stop by the phone booth outside Miller's Grocery. I'd hold a few coins in my hand, staring at them, wondering if I should call. But every time, something stopped me. What if he was busy? What if I interrupted dinner? What if he answered but didn't sound happy to hear me? So I'd walk back home with the coin still in my pocket, listening to the gravel crunch under my shoes, pretending it was just another day. Spring came, and the magnolias bloomed outside the churchyard. Mrs. Caldwell told me I should visit Daniel, that it wasn't right for a mother to wait this long. She meant well, but she didn't understand. A mother's pride can be a strange thing. We don't want to be a burden. We don't want to show up and make anyone uncomfortable. So I wrote instead. Every Sunday night, I'd sit at the kitchen table, pen in hand, writing little updates about the town, how Mr. Thompson finally painted his fence, how the river flooded again, how the school choir sang at the fair. I'd always end the same way. We miss you here. Come home soon. Weeks would pass before I heard anything back. Sometimes, not at all. Then one afternoon, out of nowhere, the phone rang. I almost dropped the dish I was washing. I ran to the hallway, heart pounding. Hello? And there it was, his voice. Familiar, but thinner. Hey, Ma, how are you? Just 3 words, and my eyes filled with tears. We talked for 10 minutes, maybe less. He told me work was busy, that they just moved into a new apartment. I could hear traffic in the background, horns, voices, a whole different world from my quiet kitchen. I asked if they were eating well, if he was sleeping enough. He laughed and said, "You still worry too much." I wanted to tell him I couldn't help it, that mothers don't just stop worrying. But the words stuck in my throat. Before hanging up, he said, "We'll visit soon, Ma, maybe this summer." That maybe echoed in my head long after the call ended. Summer came and went, no visit. Instead, another letter from Linda arrived. She wrote about Daniel's promotion, about the California sunshine, about how life was moving so fast. She mentioned how Daniel wanted to come, but work wouldn't allow time off. I told myself it was fine, that he was busy building a future. That's what every mother wants, right? But at night, when the cicadas sang and the air grew thick with memory, I'd sit by the window and whisper, "You promised, Danny." A year later, I got an invitation in the mail to their baby shower. My first grandchild, I remember pressing the envelope to my chest and crying before I even opened it. A grandchild, a new life, a little piece of my boy in this world again. I went straight to town to buy gifts, tiny socks, a yellow blanket, and a small silver rattle. The lady at the store wrapped them carefully in paper and ribbon. I even baked cookies for the trip. For the first time in years, I felt alive. When I told the neighbors, they smiled, truly happy for me. "It'll be good for you to travel," they said. I didn't tell them what I really feared, that maybe I wasn't wanted there. Still, I packed a suitcase and took the train west. California was everything I wasn't used to, fast, loud, shining with things I didn't understand. When I reached their address, I stood outside for a while, holding my suitcase, staring at the building. The windows were big, the walls painted white. I took a deep breath and knocked. Linda opened the door. Her smile was polite, but not warm. "Oh, Mrs. Carter, we didn't expect you this early." There it was, the first crack. Inside, everything smelled new furniture, flowers, perfume. Daniel came out from the kitchen, surprised. "Ma, you're here." He hugged me, quick and careful, like I might break. I smiled up at him. "I told you I'd come see my grandbaby." Linda laughed softly, glancing at him. "Well, the baby's not here yet, but we're getting ready." They offered me tea, asked about the town, about the weather. The small talk felt strange, like I was visiting strangers instead of family. When I showed them the gifts, Linda said, "Oh, that's sweet, but we already have most of these things." And she didn't mean it cruelly, but the words stung all the same. Later, when Daniel showed me the nursery, I ran my hand along the little crib and said quietly, "You had one just like this. Your father built it." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I remember." But he didn't look at me long. Dinner that night was quiet. They talked about people I didn't know, work, friends, Neighbors, plans. I nodded, pretending to follow. I wanted to ask Daniel about his health, about whether he still played guitar like he used to, but every time I opened my mouth, Linda would fill the silence with something else. By the end of the meal, I felt like a guest who had stayed too long. That night, I cried quietly in the guest room. The walls were thin. I could hear them laughing softly in the next room, talking about paint colors and baby names. I pressed my pillow against my face to muffle the sound. The next morning, Daniel offered to drive me to the station. I told him it wasn't necessary, but he insisted. On the way there, I looked out the window, trying to memorize the way his reflection looked in the glass. Older, sharper, distant. At one point, I said, "You don't write much these days." He sighed. "Yeah, I know. Things have been hectic. You know how it is." I nodded. "I suppose so." Then I asked quietly, "Will you come home after the baby's born?" He didn't answer right away. And we'll see, Ma. It's a long trip. When we reached the station, he carried my bag, kissed my cheek, and said, "Love you, Ma." And then he was gone, just like that. As the train pulled away, I pressed my hand to the window, watching him fade into the blur of the city. I didn't know then that it would be years before I saw him again. Back home, the days fell into a rhythm, the kind that hurts and heals at the same time. I sent letters after the baby was born, but never got a reply. Sometimes a Christmas card arrived, always signed, "Love, Daniel and Linda." No photos, no calls. I heard through neighbors someone's cousin knew someone who saw them once at an airport, that they had 2 children now. 2 grandchildren I'd never held. There were moments I thought about going again, showing up like before, but the memory of that polite smile at the door stopped me. Instead, I kept the nursery ready, Daniel's old room. Clean sheets, toys, and the same rocking chair his father built. Hope is a stubborn thing. It stays even when reason leaves. Then one day, years later, I got a call. It was Linda. Her voice was flat, formal. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "Daniel's been in an accident. He's okay, but he's in the hospital." The world went still. I dropped everything and took the first bus I could find. 12 hours on the road, 12 hours of praying, remembering, fearing. When I reached the hospital, she was waiting in the hallway. "He's sleeping," she said. "They said he'll recover." When I saw him, all grown and pale under those bright white lights, something in me broke. I wanted to hold him like I did when he was small, to tell him everything would be all right. But I just sat there, holding his hand. When he opened his eyes, he smiled faintly. "Hey, Ma." That moment, just those 2 words, healed something in me I didn't even know was still bleeding. We didn't talk about the years apart. We didn't need to. The silence said everything. But deep down, I still wondered, would things go back to how they were? Would he really come home again? The night after Daniel's accident, I stayed by his bedside until the nurse turned the lights low. The machines beeped softly, steady, calm. His hand rested in mine, and for the first time in years, I felt peace. When morning came, Linda arrived with a bouquet of lilies and a paper cup of coffee. She smiled politely. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked. I nodded, even though I hadn't slept at all. We sat in silence for a while. Then she said, "He's been working too much." I told him to slow down. Her voice cracked slightly, and I realized for the first time that she wasn't my enemy. She was just another person who loved the same man I did. Still, something in her tone made me ache. I wanted to say, "You should have called me. I would have come sooner." But I didn't. Some words, once spoken, can't be taken back. Over the next few days, I helped however I could, bringing food, straightening his sheets, reading the newspaper out loud. Daniel smiled more each day. "Ma," he said once, half laughing, "you're spoiling me again." I smiled back, but inside, I wanted to say, that's all I ever wanted to do. One afternoon, while he napped, I went to the hospital cafeteria. It was crowded with people, doctors, families, workers. I found a quiet corner and sat down. That's when I overheard 2 women talking at the next table. "Did you hear about that man in room 308? One said. "His wife's been here day and night." Poor thing. She looks worn out. Yeah, the other replied. They said his mother came in from out of state. Must be hard. He's been away from home for years. Something about that line, away from home for years, hit me harder than I expected. It was true. He hadn't just left the town, he'd left me. That evening, as I walked back to his room, I stopped outside the door. I heard voices inside Daniel's and Linda's. Ma means well, he was saying. She's just lonely. I know, Linda replied softly. But she keeps trying to hold on. It makes you feel guilty. There was a pause. Then Daniel said quietly, yeah, sometimes it does. I froze. My fingers tightened on the doorknob. My throat burned. I wanted to walk in and tell him he was wrong, that I never wanted to make him feel guilty. I just wanted to be his mother. But instead, I stepped back. I walked outside into the cool night air and sat on a bench under the streetlight. The hum of the city surrounded me, cars passing, sirens in the distance, voices echoing down the block. For the first time in my life, I felt completely invisible. That night, I prayed not for him to need me again, but for the strength to let him go. The next morning, I told Linda I was going back home. She looked surprised. Already he's doing better, but he'll want you here? I shook my head. He's got you. And the children. He doesn't need me to hover. When Daniel woke up and heard I was leaving, he frowned. But Ma, you just got here. I smiled, brushing his hair back like I used to. I came to see you, open your eyes. That's enough for me. He didn't argue, but his eyes softened that same blue I'd known since he was a boy. Call me when you get home, he said. I promised I would. The train ride home felt heavier this time. I looked out the window and saw miles of open fields, old barns, and rivers, the same scenery I'd watched decades ago when he was a child beside me, pressing his face against the glass, pointing at cows and windmills. Now the seat beside me was empty. When I got home, the house felt smaller, quieter, but it was mine. For a while, I went back to my routines, morning walks, tending to the garden, volunteering at the church bake sale. Life was slow, gentle, but there was an ache beneath every ordinary day. Then one autumn morning, I got a small envelope in the mail. The handwriting was Daniel's. Inside was a photo, the first I'd received in years. Daniel stood with two little children beside him, smiling wide under a tree full of red leaves. On the back, in his handwriting, it said, Mom, meet Emily and Jack. They keep me on my toes. Love you. I held that photo to my chest and cried. For weeks, I looked at it every day sometimes, talking to the children in the picture, telling them stories they'd never heard. That photo stayed on the mantle. It was my comfort through every long night. Years passed like that. Letters came every few months, short but kind. They never visited, but I learned to live with that. Until one winter, when the snow came early and I got another call. This time it wasn't about Daniel. It was from him. Ma, he said, his voice trembling, we're coming home for Christmas. I dropped the dish towel in my hand. What? He laughed softly. Yeah, the kids have been asking to meet Grandma. We thought, it's time. My heart stopped, then started again with a rush of warmth I hadn't felt in years. The week before Christmas, I baked for days, pies, cookies, bread, all his favorites. I decorated the old tree with ornaments he'd made in school paper stars, little felt bells. Every corner of the house smelled like cinnamon and pine. When the day came, I stood by the window in my best dress, watching the snow fall. The sound of a car pulling up made my heart race. Daniel stepped out first, taller now, gray in his hair. Then Linda, smiling softly. And behind them, two children, faces bright red from the cold, running ahead with laughter. Grandma, one of them shouted before I could even breathe. They hugged me, both of them, their little arms tight around my waist. I could barely speak. When I finally looked up, Daniel was standing in the doorway, eyes glistening. Ma, he said quietly, I'm sorry it took so long. I smiled through my tears. You came. That's what matters. That Christmas night, we sat around the fire, telling old stories. The children giggled as I told them about the time their father fell into the pond chasing frogs, and Daniel laughed so hard he nearly cried. Linda helped me serve pie, her hand brushing mine gently. You bake just like my grandmother, she said with a smile. It was the first time I felt warmth from her real warmth. When everyone went to bed, I stayed by the fire alone. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It was full of life again. I whispered softly, "Thank you, God," not out of habit, but from a place deep inside me, gratitude for the second chance I thought would never come. But the real turning point came not that night. It came the next morning. I woke early to find Daniel sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. He looked up as I joined him. "Do you remember when we used to sit out here and count the birds?" he asked. I nodded. "You were always the first to spot the cardinals." He smiled. Then he grew quiet. "Ma," he said finally, "I need to tell you something." I turned to him, my heart suddenly heavy. He took a deep breath. "After Dad died, I didn't know how to handle it. You were so strong, but I wasn't. Every time I came home, I saw him in every room, and it hurt. I thought staying away would make it easier. I didn't speak. I just let the tears roll down. I should have called. I should have written more. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was just running from you, from home." He turned to me then, eyes red. "I'm sorry, Ma. I really am." I reached for his hand. "You don't need to say sorry, Danny. I understand. We all run from something, but what matters is that you came back." He nodded, his shoulders shaking slightly. And just like that, years of silence melted in the morning light. That was the morning my son truly came home, not just in body, but in heart. The porch creaked beneath us as the sun rose higher, golden light spilling over the yard. The frost on the grass began to melt. And for the first time in decades, I felt whole again. After months of tension and unanswered expectations, I began to notice small shifts, not dramatic, not sudden, but subtle changes that spoke louder than any words could. Life, I realized, was teaching me patience in a way I hadn't understood before. It started with my own quiet reflections. I would sit alone in the early mornings, watching the sun rise over the rooftops, feeling the chill of the morning air, and thinking about all that had happened. I tried to examine my feelings without judgment, the disappointment, the sadness, the worry. I let myself acknowledge them, to name them, and slowly I felt the tension in my chest begin to loosen. There was still hurt, yes, but it wasn't the sharp, consuming ache it had been. One afternoon, I decided to reach out again, not expecting a visit, not hoping for a sudden change, but simply to offer a message from my heart. I sent him a text, short and gentle. "I hope you and my daughter are doing well. I love you both, and I'm always here if you need anything." I didn't get an immediate reply, and that was okay. I didn't wait by the phone, didn't let anxiety creep in. Instead, I let the thought pass, like a leaf floating down a quiet stream. It was a small act, but it felt important. It reminded me that love isn't always loud or visible. It can be quiet, patient, and steadfast, even when it isn't acknowledged. Visiting my daughter became a little different during this time. I no longer arrived with expectations or unspoken hopes. Instead, I went with calm, with a willingness to be present simply for her. And it changed everything. The apartment, once tense and heavy with silent disappointment, began to feel warmer. My daughter smiled more easily, laughed more freely. She still loved him, yes, but I could see that she had begun to balance her expectations too. She understood that life doesn't always unfold the way we imagine, and that sometimes peace comes from acceptance, not insistence. I remember one particular evening clearly. The sun had dipped low, and the soft light spilled across the kitchen floor. I had baked her favorite bread, and we sat together, sharing slices and tea. He was there too, though still quiet. Instead of expecting warmth, I simply acknowledged his presence with a nod and a small smile. And that was enough. "It smells wonderful, Mom," my daughter said, her voice bright. "Thank you." I smiled, feeling a small joy that had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with unmet expectations. It was about her happiness, her calm, her sense of ease. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. The resolution I had been searching for wasn't about him changing, or visits being kept, or promises being fulfilled. It was about letting go of the tension, releasing my quiet resentment, and choosing peace over pain. Slowly, day by day, life returned to a new rhythm. The missed calls, the empty chairs, the polite silences, they didn't disappear, but they became easier to bear. I learned to focus on the moments that mattered, the small gestures of love that couldn't be taken for granted, a hug from my daughter, a shared laugh, the simple warmth of presence without expectation. These things became my anchor. I also noticed the effect on my daughter. She had begun to navigate her marriage with a quiet wisdom, learning to accept that people show love in different ways. She still hoped for his attention, for his visits, but she no longer allowed disappointment to shadow every interaction. Watching her grow in this way gave me a quiet satisfaction, a deep sense of relief. I realized that sometimes helping someone find their own peace is the greatest gift we can give. There were days when I still felt the old pang of hurt, especially when I remembered promises made and broken. But I stopped letting them dominate my thoughts. Instead, I acknowledged them briefly and then let them pass. The sorrow became something softer, something reflective rather than consuming. And in that softness, I found space to breathe, to smile, and to feel gratitude for what I still had: my daughter, her happiness, and the enduring love between us. One quiet afternoon, I sat on the porch, a cup of tea warming my hands. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and blooming flowers. I thought about everything that had passed the wedding: the silence, the tension, the small arguments and misunderstandings. And I realized something profound. The resolution wasn't about changing anyone else. It was about changing myself, about adjusting my heart to the reality I couldn't control, and finding peace in the love that remained steady and true. I began to see life differently. I noticed small things that I had overlooked before: the way my daughter's laughter lingered in a room, the warmth of sunlight on our hands during morning visits, the quiet moments where we simply sat together, no words needed. These moments became sacred. They reminded me that life, even with its disappointments, is full of beauty if we choose to see it. As the weeks turned into months, I no longer felt the heaviness of expectation. I could visit without anticipating disappointment. I could speak without wondering if my words were being measured. And the world, I realized, felt a little softer, a little more forgiving. There was still distance, yes, and perhaps always would be, but that distance no longer hurt in the same way. I had learned to fill the spaces with understanding, with patience, with love that didn't demand reciprocation. And in doing so, I found a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed, a strength that came not from changing others, but from embracing life as it is. Looking back, I understood that this resolution was a gift. Not the gift of perfect circumstances, not the gift of kept promises, but the gift of perspective. I had learned to hold love gently, to release expectations, and to find contentment in the warmth that remained. It was a calm, enduring kind of peace, one that carried me through the days with quiet joy and gentle reflection. And so I moved forward, step by step, learning to cherish the small victories, the subtle joys, and the enduring love that cannot be taken away. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, steady calm. I had faced disappointment, navigated hurt, and emerged with a heart that was tender, resilient, and open to life, no matter what it brought next. I remember the day, clearly, the day I finally felt a quiet peace settle over my heart. It wasn't sudden like a door slamming shut, but soft and slow like sunlight spilling across the floor after a long gray morning. I sat in my living room, the same couch where I had spent countless evenings worrying, and I breathed in the silence. For the first time in months, it didn't feel heavy. My daughter called that afternoon. Her voice was warm, calm, and full of the kind of happiness that only comes when you've survived something difficult. "Mom," she said, "I think I understand things a little better now." I smiled softly, my fingers brushing against the phone as if I could feel the comfort of her presence through the line. "I'm glad, sweetheart. Tell me everything." She laughed quietly. "Well, he's different than I thought. Not bad, just not ready to show up the way we expected. And I realized, Mom, that it's not your fault, not mine. Some things just happen. People don't always live up to their promises." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Her words felt like gentle rain, washing away months of worry and tension. I realized then that I didn't need apologies or explanations or even visits. I just needed understanding, and I had it from my daughter, from myself, from the quiet knowing that life sometimes unfolds in ways we cannot control. A few days later, I visited their apartment again. My daughter greeted me with a bright smile, and this time I felt no expectation, no tension. He was there too, sitting quietly in the living room. I looked at him, and instead of frustration or hurt, I felt calm. I nodded politely, and he nodded back. That was enough. Words weren't necessary. Presence, even distant, was enough. We spent the afternoon talking, laughing, and sharing small stories as we always had. There were moments of quiet, but they were comfortable now, not heavy. I realized something important. Love isn't always about grand gestures or keeping every promise. Sometimes it's about being gentle with each other, about accepting people as they are, and finding peace even when things don't go as planned. As I left that evening, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow across the street. My daughter hugged me tightly. "Thank you for being patient, Mom," she whispered, "for understanding." I held her a little longer than usual, feeling the warmth of her arms, the softness of her hair against my cheek. "Always, sweetheart, always." Walking home, I looked up at the sky, the colors shifting slowly from gold to deep blue. I felt a quiet joy, a sense of closure. The disappointment hadn't disappeared completely. It never truly does, but it had softened into something I could carry with grace. Life, I realized, was full of broken promises and unexpected turns, but it was also full of love, understanding, and the small moments that make everything worthwhile. That night, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I thought about the journey we had been through. I thought about my daughter, her happiness, and the lessons we had both learned. And I whispered softly to the quiet room, almost as if it were a prayer. Sometimes people let us down. Sometimes life isn't perfect. But love always finds a way to heal, even in the silence. I looked out at the stars, blinking faintly through the darkness. And for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. My heart wasn't empty. It was full of hope, gratitude, and the quiet strength that comes from weathering storms. And I knew without a doubt that no matter what happened next, I could face it calmly, lovingly, and with the knowledge that life, in all its imperfections, was still beautiful.